So that's what I just said. So it's remarkable. If you just look at the really low capital labor ratios, and these are the data points from 1820, 50 up to 1990, they just overlap completely. There's no progress at all at the low end because of all the technical change that's happened in the world in the last couple of centuries. Poor countries haven't got anything. It all's happening at the high capital intensity level. So poor countries are poor because they use antique technology. In fact, they're all using kind of technology that was developed a long time ago. So what's the one industry that all poor countries are successful in and export in? And it's clothing. If you go through a big department store and look at all the clothing and look at the labels to see where it comes from, it's Honduras, it's Mali, it's Bangladesh, it's one poor country after another, and there are lots of them are represented there, right? Well, what's the technology for making clothes? It's the sewing machine. The treadle sewing machine's invented in the 1850s, the electric sewing machine in 1889. It's this kind of low capital intensive technology that's appropriate to a low-wage country. It's what they use and where they're successful. It's an example of this kind of process I'm talking about. So, you know, why is that? Why is the capital labor ratio high in placer gold mining in California and low in Ghana, where they do it like that? And I think basically it's because that all that machinery that they're using in California wouldn't pay in Ghana, where wages are much lower, and it doesn't pay to mechanize the operation. So there's a kind of trap. What a country like Ghana needs to become prosperous like us is this capital-intensive technology, but it doesn't actually pay anybody to install it. So there's a big problem. This is the point about, I said that. Here's another example. This is this goes back to my graduate student days, so it's a really ancient history example. But in 1800, cotton cloth was made all around the world. In India, it was woven on pit looms like this by hand, like the hand looms in Ethiopia today. In Britain, it was woven on power looms like this, a lot more capital per worker, right? Well, in the USA, they developed a completely automatic loom, the Northrop loom. Northrop was an English immigrant who went to Britain to realize his invention, or went to the US to realize his invention. This has lots more capital per worker, very high labor productivity, and the British don't use it. They stick with this. So one of the big problems in economic history when I was a graduate student was trying to understand whether there was entrepreneurial failure in Britain. They didn't seem to use the most advanced technology in the late 19th century. Was this because they were bad businessmen, had a bad culture, a non-industrial culture, lots of theories? Or was it just that it didn't pay? And when you investigate these cases, it turns out that it only pays to use the Northrop loom when wages are really high, and America was the highest wage place in the world. And it didn't pay in Britain, even though that was pretty high wage too. So it wouldn't have paid in India for sure, right? So you see that the choice of technique in these countries depends on the wage level, and it's different. And also that the adoption and development of the new technology reflects the same forces, that the highly capital intensive technologies that developed where wages are high, but it's not usable and profitable to use in poor countries. All right, I've given you a lot about technology. I'll go faster over the globalization. Globalization is another big change in the world economy. The economy has become more integrated as transportation has improved. And here we see railways, steamships. That was 19th century technology. We had airplanes, container ships, right? All of this reduces the cost of shipping goods between countries, makes the world economy more and more integrated, reduces price differences between countries, and so forth. This has a huge impact on divergent development. So as the world becomes more tightly integrated, then the economic principle of comparative advantage comes more and more forcefully into play. All right, and that means that countries will tend to specialize in the areas of producing the things where they're relatively efficient, they can do relatively efficiently. So that means that if a country like Britain in 1800 develops a lot of machine technology that rams up its efficiency in manufacturing, its comparative advantage in manufacturing increases, and so it'll become more competitive, and the manufacturing sector will increase there, and it'll decrease conversely in countries like India, where this is not happening. And indeed, where it can't happen because it doesn't pay to adopt the British machinery. So this has been, I think, the story of the world. So we can see this. I mean, what I just told you was what economists call the general equilibrium argument, reasoning rather abstractly about the different sectors of the economy. We can see how it plays out in the markets for cotton cloth and raw cotton. So the basic facts are that China and India were the biggest cotton textile producers in 1750, and Britain was trivial importance in 1750. But machines made Britain the low-cost producer, and it was British competition that destroyed cotton manufacturing across Asia and Africa. And the reason that the British manufacturing got so big was that they concentrated such a huge proportion of the world's consumption into their factories, right? So here's, this shows you the cotton cloth market from 1781 to 1901. The light blue line here is the price of cotton cloth in India. And at the end of the 18th century, the dark blue line is the price of cotton cloth in London, in England, and the brown line is the price of English cotton cloth in England. And back here at the beginning, there's a big difference between the prices, all right? But by the time you get to the 1820, the prices are all close together. So that's market integration. That's what happens when you have better transportation, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the end of the East India Company's trading monopoly, all these things. Price differences collapse. That's one thing to notice. Another thing is, of course, in this constellation of prices here at the end of the 18th century, it pays to buy cotton in India and ship it to London, where all the prices are high, right? So that's how the trade goes. The Indian industry is supplying the English market. Then what happens here is the brown line's going down. As the English invent machines that increases their efficiency, drives down the price of cotton cloth in England, and the price of English cloth, and the price of Indian cloth comes down too, because they're close substitutes, and consumers won't pay much more for Indian cloth than for English cloth. So it's dragged down here. By the time you get to the 1820s, there's a really important change here. The English cloth is now cheaper because of mechanization, English cloth in England, than Indian cloth in India, right? So it no longer pays to ship from India to England, it pays to ship from England to India. And so the whole trade reverses. You stop getting any prices for Indian cloth in England because nobody's going to ship there. And instead the British are shipping their cloth, which is the cheapest, to India where it's more expensive. And the prices keep going down over the 19th century, and the English price is always below the Indian price, and the Indian producers all go out of business, right? Because it's just too cheap. When it gets too cheap, it doesn't pay anybody to weave cloth at all in India, and to spin at all, and weaving is really cut back a lot. On the other hand, as this is happening, we see convergence in the price of raw cotton, the agricultural commodity, in Liverpool and in Gujarat. They get there, again, the English prices are much higher. By the middle of the 19th century, the gap is really small. And the Indian price is always less than the English price, and the Indian price is rising gradually. So raw cotton is exported from India to Britain, and resources are drawn into the agricultural sector. So this is the other half of deindustrialization. The manufacturing sector collapses under British competition, but the demand for the raw product increases, and the Indian economy shifts to becoming an agricultural economy rather than one of the biggest industrial manufacturing economies in the world. So when I was a graduate student, I remember being told that the problem of economic development was figuring out how to get traditional societies to grow. That's what Walt Rostow told us in the Stages of Economic Growth. But that's all fantasy history. The less developed countries of the early 20th century they hadn't been like that all the time. The traditional structure was not purely agricultural. They had been the world's great manufacturing economies, but they'd been undone by technical change and globalization. So less developed countries were made, they weren't born. Right? They were the products of biased technical change and globalization. So then the next question is, how could poor countries catch up to the rich countries? I mean, is the world going to end like that or not? What do you do? So it's interesting. The economies of Western Europe and North America were threatened with the same deindustrialization forces as India and China, right? And indeed, the colonial American economy was totally deindustrialized. And there wasn't any manufacturing to speak of in the colonies. Everything was imported from Britain. And so this sort of situation threatened to continue in the 19th century because generally wages on the continent, at least, were lower than in Britain, and energy prices were higher. So British technology wasn't really cost effective. So they had to wait. They either had to invent technology that would suit their conditions or wait for the British to improve theirs enough so it was cost effective. So they were in a rather weak position. But they had a response. There was a policy response that was the general policy response in the countries in Western Europe and North America. And this is what I call the standard 19th century development model. And it's got 4 imperatives. The first is create a unified national market by eliminating internal tariffs and constructing infrastructure, roads, canals, railways. Or second is erect an external tariff to protect your industries against British competition until you can figure out how to either import or invent appropriate technologies that matches your input situation so you can compete effectively. The third is develop a banking system to stabilize the currency and, in some cases, directly finance industrial development. And the fourth is mass education, to train people and educate people so they can work effectively in a commercial and industrial environment. And these policies are first thought out actually in the United States. The 1788 Constitution abolished state tariffs and created the legal basis for a unified national market. Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, the first Treasury Secretary, in his famous report on manufactures in 1792, advocated the internal improvements, that's the transport stuff, the external tariff and the Bank of the United States to stabilize the financial system. These were all eventually adopted. And the fourth, the mass education, was a legacy from the colonial period, where the USA had very high literacy rates, as did England, and I think for the same reasons, that the demand for education was high because it was so commercially oriented and wages were high so people could afford it. And then this was carried on with an extension in the 19th century of land-grant colleges, the common school movement, and so forth. So these become increasingly economic in their orientation, but you can say that mass education became almost as American as high tariffs. So that was a model that was adopted by countries that caught up. Could the poor countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America use the standard model to catch up as well, right? I mean, why didn't they just copy what the US had done? Some made the effort and even fewer succeeded. Colonies could do very little, right, since their economic policies and social policies were subordinated to the interests of the imperial power. So Indian nationalists, for instance, what they wanted was the standard model, but they didn't get it. So there was no state provision of any consequence to education. Only 1% of the population was in school in the 19th century. Literacy was on the order of 6% rather than 60% as it was in Western Europe. Tariffs were low and for revenue purposes only. There was no policy to promote banking or for stabilizing the currency or industrial capital. The only thing that happened was a railway system was built. And it was aimed to export farm products and contributed to the further deindustrialization of the country and the shift of resources into agriculture. Some countries tried versions of the standard model. Mexico messed about with it. They had a tariff and a small investment bank in the 1830s. One of the points about this is these countries do it frequently in a very half-hearted way. So the Mexicans had a tariff and a little investment bank, but they didn't create a national market by abolishing state tariffs until the 1880s, didn't build railroads till then. They didn't have mass education until after the Second World War. They made one policy innovation in the 1880s, which was relying on foreign firms. You know, the countries of Western Europe and the USA, almost all of their capital was domestic savings. They didn't rely on foreign investment. And they relied on their own firms. They didn't rely on foreign firms to bring in technology, which is what Mexico did. These policies half-hearted policies had a half-hearted effect. There was some slow growth, a few percent per year in per capita income, but it wasn't enough to make for tight labor markets, for instance, and real wages stagnated through the whole period of the late 19th century, and the result was a revolution in 1911 and failure of the Standard Model.